This Spotlight series is going to be about developing a strategic plan for automated regression testing. The first section I'll cover is how the need for regression testing has changed under the new lifecycle process called Selective Adoption. I'll spend some time reviewing the important concepts of Selective Adoption and show you how it changes the need for automated testing. The second part of this session will cover what you need to consider when developing a strategy for regression testing. Planning a strategy and setting it in motion can be difficult, especially if you have to reset and change the way you are doing something. There are a lot of barriers that keep you from starting with an automated test strategy, and I'll talk about what those are. I'll go back over the strategic areas. In the third section, we'll focus on PeopleSoft Test Framework. PeopleSoft Test Framework is an automated test tool that comes delivered with PeopleTools. I'll go back over the strategic areas to cover with regression testing and talk about how PTF can fit into the strategy. You'll see that there are some things that PeopleSoft Test Framework does very well and other things it's not particularly strong at. And finally, I'll point you to where you can go for more detailed information about PeopleSoft Test Framework. Let's start with a review of PeopleSoft's lifecycle maintenance process, Selective Adoption. Let's talk about how that's changed your approach to maintaining PeopleSoft applications. For more information, there's a Spotlight series of videos available on Selective Adoption. Selective Adoption is the name given to the overall lifecycle process for PeopleSoft applications. It's used by all applications at the 9.2 level, as well as the Interaction Hub in version 9.1. Selective Adoption changed the way PeopleSoft delivered application bug fixes and new enhancements, and it changed the process in which the customer applies change. The biggest change that must be understood by all customers is now the customer determines what their maintenance strategy is, not PeopleSoft. Let me explain that. Prior to Selective Adoption, the maintenance strategy for every customer was determined by PeopleSoft. The process was to get onto a release with all your customizations, then when PeopleSoft delivered bundles, apply them in sequential order. Since the bundles had to be applied in order, each customer was required to stay current. At the same time, PeopleSoft would be off working on new features and enhancements that would be available as a new release. The customer would then have to go through a major upgrade to get new features. Selective Adoption changed that model significantly. First, new features are delivered on a regular basis, not as upgrades. Second, customers choose what maintenance and features to apply and when to apply them. And third, because new features are delivered as part of maintenance, PeopleSoft will never deliver a major upgrade again. With these changes, each customer has the responsibility of setting their own maintenance strategy. The fact that this has changed and the customer is in control is significant. Many customers have grasped onto this and realized the potential that this gives them. They've changed their mindset about how PeopleSoft applications are maintained and now think of them as agile systems, being updated with new features and enhancements on a regular basis. They've adjusted project schedules and budgets accordingly and are constantly looking at ways to get more from this process. When I talk about customers setting their own maintenance strategy, what do I mean? Well, let's take a look. Your lifecycle strategy may include maintenance rules like the ones listed here. Everyone should have a get current strategy for update images. PeopleSoft recommends getting current about every 12 to 18 months. The longer you go, the more difficult the process will be. Selective Adoption and PeopleSoft Update Manager give you different get current options. Some customers are getting current with the entire product lines, while others are staggering get current projects within products to spread the effort out. In any case, doing so on a regular basis is work, but it's not the project that a major upgrade used to be. In between the get current projects, your system may be going through a lot of change. There's standard maintenance fixes that you will always have to do. Things like critical bug fixes, security vulnerabilities, performance fixes, and legislative changes. In addition, there are new features that business owners will want to be added to the system. These include things like dashboards, analytics, new fluid content, and others. Selective Adoption and PeopleSoft Update Manager let you do this. They let you take just the changes you want, whether they're maintenance or new features, and apply them to your system. These are examples of the power and control you now have with PeopleSoft applications. I think you can all agree that with the new maintenance approach, your PeopleSoft systems encounter more change and are more agile than ever. PeopleSoft understands that and delivers the lifecycle tools that help you with this process to make it easier for you to manage. Now let's take a look at those. PeopleSoft has invested quite a bit in the tools that are used in the selective adoption process. All changes are now delivered in a working PeopleSoft image that can be run in a VirtualBox or on any compatible virtual machine, bare metal, or cloud environment. This lets users look at and try new features with virtually no effort other than downloading an image. IT and developers can use the image to see how the change was implemented. The PeopleSoft Update Manager lets you select just what you want to apply, and Change Assistant leads you through the process of applying changes to your system. Then there's the PeopleSoft Test Framework. The big difference between PeopleSoft Test Framework and the other tools listed here is that PTF is not required. You can maintain your systems without using it. We'll talk more about that later. As far as applying change, by far the most time-consuming and costly resistance to applying change is the amount and type of customizations you have in your system. This has always been the case with PeopleSoft, and it hasn't changed with selective adoption. In product areas that aren't customized, applying maintenance is pretty easy, and there's relatively few problems. I guess it makes sense that applying what PeopleSoft changed to what PeopleSoft delivered is usually pretty safe. Sure, there can be issues, but when they are, they typically surface quickly, and fixes are turned around quickly. In product areas that are moderately or heavily customized, it becomes much more difficult to apply maintenance, and it's much more prone to errors. Customizations are a critical part of every PeopleSoft system. They provide a strategic advantage and can be a differentiator for your business. PeopleSoft will always support the ability to customize, and customers should take advantage of it. Lately, there's been a move or a shift from customizing delivered components, records, pages, people code, to configurations which are made in application data. Those are new PeopleSoft features like dashboards, pivot grids, and activity guides. Knowing all this, there is still one thing that can be done to make your business systems more agile and to make maintenance more easy, and that is automating your regression testing. Stop now and think for a second. When you have a project to maintain or you want to add new features to a PeopleSoft system, how much of the project time is spent testing? A rather large change like a get current over several images, say you want to do a get current from image 12 to image 18, how much of the time is going to be spent testing? I've heard customers tell me anywhere from 50% all the way up to 80%. That's a range from about half the time to over 3/4 of the time. What if this time could be reduced? What if you could save just a small amount, say 10%? That would certainly be worth the investment. If you could save more time, 15-20% of your testing time, maybe even more, that would be even more significant. Anytime you change the system, you run the risk of introducing regressions. Testing must be done to find the regressions or ensure that none have been introduced. Now that your system is more agile than it has been in the past, you can expect more time spent testing. So how do you improve the testing time? The best way to do it is with automation. Now let's take a look at the steps that it takes to build a regression test strategy in your organization. First of all, let's talk about what regression testing is. Now there's many different types of testing that your organization does on a regular basis. Some of those are listed here. There's smoke tests. These are the basic tests that show that all parts are up and working. A smoke test for PeopleSoft could be something like log on, open a component, and save the data. By going through that process, we know that the client, the web server, the app server, and the database are all configured and up and working. That's about all we could expect from a smoke test. Unit test is what you hope your developers are doing when they apply change. Unit tests only test the part of the system that was changed to make sure that the change works properly as designed. This could be a component or a page or many different things in a PeopleSoft application, like an app class. The focus and scope of a unit test is very limited. System tests are important and very broad-reaching. Do all the business processes in your application function the way that they should and work together? Integration tests are important to make sure that your system properly interacts with all the systems that it should. Performance and load testing are related but separate. Performance testing is done to make sure that the system meets minimum performance levels, and load tests check the system under maximum expected usage to make sure it's operating as expected. And finally, we get to regression testing. Well, what is regression testing? Let's take a look at a definition of regression testing. This one is pulled together from a number of sources. It reads, selective retesting of a system or parts of a system to verify that modifications have not caused unintended effects and that the system still complies with its specified requirements. In other words, did applying change have any unintended consequences? We may already know that the change was unit tested, and it may have been through other testing like integration or system testing, but the change may have impacted something else, and that's what we'll find with regression testing. Anyone that's been around business systems for any amount of time has seen it. They've said, wow, I never expected the change that was made to cause that problem. Part of the reason is that business systems are very complex. It's very difficult for any individual programmer to know all the consequences about making a change. PeopleSoft applications are particularly susceptible to regressions because of the flexibility of people tools. Changes to records, record people code, app classes, queries, even things like security profiles may have unintended consequences. The more dynamic your business system is, the more potential you have to introduce regressions. The more efficient you are at finding and preventing the regressions before they happen, the more dynamic your system can be. That's why managing the lifecycle of a PeopleSoft application with selective adoption, automated regression testing is highly recommended. In fact, you could say that it's required. Many customers will tell you that automated testing is a critical part of implementing lifecycle with selective adoption. So let's talk about what an automated regression test strategy for PeopleSoft application includes. There are 4 main parts to consider: the need for regression testing, the scope of the test, how you will do the testing or the approach, and finally the criteria for successful testing. Each of these needs to be considered and worked through as part of setting a regression test plan. One important thing before we go on: when you're setting a regression test strategy for your organization, you must think about it in the long term. Think about regression testing PeopleSoft over the life of the application, not just for a single patch or for a single update. Your view of testing and the importance of automation becomes much more clear when you think long-term rather than short. I've mentioned before that PeopleSoft applications are particularly susceptible to regressions, so regression testing is a critical part of any maintenance project. It's the nature of the technology and the way the applications are built. Data views, people code functions, app classes, records, subrecords, subpages, all the parts that make up PeopleSoft technology are reused all over the application. Products within a pillar are designed not just to work together, but often share technology. When one changes, there's always the potential to impact others. To say that a change will not result in an undesirable consequence is not practical without validating through testing. We spent the first part of the discussion talking about how selective adoption has changed the way you maintain PeopleSoft applications. Your applications are more agile than they used to be. You apply maintenance and new features more often than you used to in the past. When you consider the amount of change with selective adoption, you very quickly come to the conclusion that automated regression testing is a requirement for success. But here's the catch. You can take any single project and determine that the cost of manually testing will be less expensive than automating if automated regression scripts don't exist. The fact is, there's a barrier to entry that cannot be ignored. Most everyone understands that there are barriers that prevent moving to regression automation. Let's face it, manual testing has many advantages. It's very easily understood by everyone. Really, all you do is use the system. It's easy to find resources to do it. Just find users or business analysts, and there doesn't have to be a lot of synergy between IT and the business users. Anyone can test without coordination from IT and just report what they find. When they are testing, users are free to exercise the system any way they want. They may think of corner test cases that they want to try and add those to their testing, and they can do so very easily. Validating the results is easy too. The users can do it visually or manually by comparing results. One of the most difficult things about automated regression testing is that on a one-time cost basis, it will never be as cost efficient as manual testing. Automated testing requires buy-in from all levels in the organization in order to do it properly. It requires coordination between IT and the business owners. Test cases must be defined and documented. That's typically the job of business owners. Test cases must then be created, run, and analyzed. That's typically the job of IT. Both sides are involved. In order to convince yourself the value of automation, stop and think of the benefits. Change is applied on a regular basis, and now the business wants to ask a question. They want to ask something like, I've applied all my changes to my core HR. Now does my recruiting module still work as expected? Being able to push a button and have an automated script answer that question for you is a tremendous benefit. Now that we've decided automation is a requirement with selective adoption, the next question is the scope. What test cases should be created, or a better way of saying it is, what areas of the system should be automated? A couple of points about this. The areas of the system that will be automated should be viewed outside the realm of any single project. Remember, we're talking about building a strategy that includes automated testing for the long term rather than just a single project. So where do you start and what should you focus on? There's a couple of different approaches. One approach is to start simple and automate parts of the system that are very static and tend to have very few regression errors. The nice part about that is that your automation projects will most likely be successful. The bad part is, of course, that automation will be of little value. Unless you're looking for a quick and easy success story, this is probably not the best way to go. Successful automation efforts are those that dive right in and meet the big challenges. The second approach is to look at your system and decide where the most regression issues occur. Maybe it's in the job definition, maybe it's something with payroll, doesn't matter. You know the areas that are most prone to regression, and you take the approach that automated testing can help find them. If you take this approach, expect the process of creating the test cases to be detailed and take time. Don't try to take on too much too quickly. Another approach is creating test cases for parts of the system that have customizations. Certainly areas that are heavily customized are prone to regressions when applying maintenance and take new features. In many cases, the parts of the system most susceptible to regression problems in the areas with the most customizations are the same. Again, expect this approach to take time as well. The fourth approach is to automate the entire product area. For instance, benefits, enrollment, or expenses. An entire area could be automated. Now when a change is applied to your system, automation can be run and entire products can be checked and said to have passed. The best advice for someone starting an automated test strategy is to start slowly and grow over time. Focus on your areas susceptible to regression issues, areas of the system that are heavily customized, and set your strategy so that over time the scope will grow to meet your needs. Determining your approach is a very important part of your strategy. There's so much involved with the approach to automated regression testing that it's difficult to complete before a project begins. If you don't spend the time up front, you may run into the problems that many automated test projects have had. Problems like unorganized or poor documentation, inconsistent testing, duplicate testing, gaps in testing, false positives, invalidated test cases, and more. All of these issues show up with poorly planned automation projects, but they can be minimized with proper planning. That is all part of defining the approach. So let's go through this. The first part is determining the automation tool that will be used. It's important to do this early when defining the approach because many things will depend on it. Your automation tool is the center of your regression test approach, and it's unlikely that once you start with one automation tool, you'll shift to another. Since PeopleSoft is a web browser HTML-based application, it works with all the leading automation tools. If you already have a standard in your organization, it's likely that you can use it with PeopleSoft applications as well. In addition, PeopleSoft provides the PeopleSoft test framework, a record and playback regression test tool as part of PeopleTools. PTF is always an option, and I'll discuss PTF in the next section. Tools don't stop just at the automation. There may be things that you need to prepare and manage test data to do things like scrub production data and tools to validate data in batch and so forth. You'll most likely find that you need to supplement the regression test tool with additional utilities. Before you start, one of the most important things to do is to set documentation standards. This includes naming conventions and test case documentation. In test case documentation, you may want to include things like the product areas the test will cover, conditions the test will run under, what the criteria for success is, what the inputs are, and what data is expected for input and output and other things. The more documentation that's captured and defined about a test case, the more portable and easier the test case is to maintain in the long run. Remember, the advantage to automation is only gained in the long term, so clear, concise documentation is required. For regression test data, most customers use copies of production data. It tends to be easy to create tests and has good quality test data readily available. It's strongly advised to scrub the data to make the test cases anonymous. There is one thing that you must be aware of when you use production data. That is, the data is not static, it's dynamic. Production data is always changing. It means if you take a cut of production data every 6 months, the data that you use for a test case may not exist anymore. Static versus dynamic test data has implications that we'll talk about later. The next 3 items, how the test is created, validated, and run, really rely on the tool that's being used. A couple of important points about these: they'll most likely be the responsible of IT or require involvement from IT rather than just business users. Many test scripts will require development efforts to get functionality that you want. Developers could be involved to enhance processes like accessing the correct test data and validating results. In any case, when you determine what your test tool will be, spend the time to define the processes to prevent regression test project from having difficulties down the road. The final step is to identify entry and exit criteria for the regression testing phase of your project. Criteria may vary based on the type of the project, may be different for a make me current versus a production down patch, but it's important to have delivered guidelines. The criteria for entering regression test phase will vary from customer to customer. Some will wait until all changes have been applied, the unit integration and other testing phases have been complete, and the system is considered to be in the finished state. Others will have a more iterative approach, where the system enters regression testing immediately after changes applied and iterates back to development when issues are found. This process can continue throughout the project. It's up to the organization to determine the best approach. Exit criteria, or moving the system out of regression tests, is a little bit more definitive. What constitutes a pass or fail should be established and followed. There should be delivered processes to follow when defects are found, and it's important to be able to quantify the code coverage so that what has been tested through automation and what has not been tested by automation is known and understood. Up to this point, I've talked about what it takes to put in place a regression test strategy, regardless of the testing tool that's used. Now I'll shift and we'll talk about how this can be achieved with PeopleSoft Test Framework. PTF is not the only regression test tool that can be used with PeopleSoft applications, but there may be some advantages to using it. So now let's get into the specifics about how PTF can be used to implement an automated regression test strategy. First, let me start by talking about what the PeopleSoft test framework is. PTF is a record and playback testing tool delivered as part of PeopleTools and available to use with any PeopleSoft web-based application free of charge. PTF works by recording the actions of a single user executing a PeopleSoft browser-based application. Users record this manual test and save the test within the PTF framework. At a later time, users can execute the recorded test against the application to verify whether the application still behaves as it did when the test was recorded. When the recorded test is executed, it does so by simulating a user using the PeopleSoft browser-based application. Most of the time, tests go above and beyond the scope of just record and playback of an application, especially when it comes to things like checking the results. PTF lets you build and modify complex tests step by step using the PTF test development platform. The test development platform has 4 primary parts: the PTF Explorer, which organizes the test assets, the test recorder, which is used to record tests, the test editor, which is an intuitive user interface where tests can be modified and customized to meet the overall needs, and the PTF log viewer, which lets you manage and view playback results. PeopleSoft Test Framework is integrated into PeopleSoft technology, and there's some advantages to that. Security, for example, is done with standard PeopleSoft security users and roles. Test cases are defined and organized in the PTF Explorer, and they're stored in the PeopleSoft database and treated as PeopleTools managed objects. That means that they're portable, and they can be added to projects and moved from one PeopleSoft system to another. There is no cost for PTF because it's built specifically to use with PeopleSoft applications. It cannot be used for non-PeopleSoft applications. There are some built-in advantages that I'll cover later in this section. The robustness is proven by the fact that PTF has been used by the PeopleSoft functional test team for many, many years. So now, let's go back to the parts that make up the regression test strategy and see how they apply when using PeopleSoft Test Framework as the automated regression test tool. First, let's talk about the need and the scope. Typically, these are outside the realm of what the automated testing tool is. Remember, we said the need is the importance of automating in your environment for your PeopleSoft applications, and the scope is the area or areas that will be automated. Selective adoption certainly helps define the need for automation. As far as the scope, PTF can influence the area that you choose for automation. Before I mentioned 4 different strategies for starting your automation. Automate areas that are rarely changed or break, automate areas where regressions tend to surface, automate areas where there are a lot of customizations, or automate entire product areas. When you choose the area that you will automate, you must remember that your tests are always subject to being invalidated by the changes you apply. If your test tries to set the value of a field and that field doesn't exist because of maintenance, then the test is invalid and it must be fixed. Choosing the scope and creating the tests where the regression surface or where there are a lot of customizations can be very valuable, but they're also the areas where tests break a lot. If you're using a standard automated testing tool, there's no way to know that the test has been broken until you try to run it. You may be able to identify tests that are subject to breakage through documentation, but that's not easy to do. With PeopleSoft Test Framework, there's a test maintenance report that compares the changes being applied to the tests in the repository. The report identifies the tests that are no longer valid based upon rules that you define and must be repaired prior to being run. This lets you know upfront which tests have to be fixed. Since test cases are defined as scripts, more often than not, the test can be fixed quickly by a developer instead of having to re-record the entire test again. Barriers to automation still exist within PeopleSoft Test Framework. It does take time to get proficient and learn the tool. The typical test developer that uses PTF is someone that has a background in software development. So they're a developer, not a functional expert, and is very detail-oriented. PTF is not a tool that is designed for end users. There's the need for collaboration between IT and the business analyst, typically with the analyst defining the tests and the IT resource building the test. PTF has several reports that require IT configuration to get up and running. You'll also find that PTF does have a user community, but it's not as large as those with other leading testing tools. Since PTF is built specifically for PeopleSoft applications, some of the features in generally available test tools are not found in PTF. Now, we talked early of the importance of documenting test cases. Good documentation and naming standards is critical. Test cases are going to live for a very long time and be used by many people, so the more quality documentation you have, the better. PeopleSoft Test Framework has several different areas for documentation. The first is the name and the description of each test case. The name should be descriptive and identify information like the product area being tested and sequence if there is one. PTF Explorer lets you organize your test cases in a hierarchy, so all the test cases from a certain functional area can be organized together. A good structure makes them more manageable and easier to find and run. Finally, there is ample area for describing the test case in detail. A few things about the data that will be used for testing. Managing test data is a very complex problem regardless of the test tool. Since PTF comes with a robust script language, the ability for test scripts to manipulate the data is unlimited. One approach for successful regression testing is to make test cases adipendent. In other words, build the test case so that they can run over and over and over many times and still give the same result. That's tricky to do, and there are some interesting approaches like resetting the data after the test case for persisting variables that can be used for the next run and so forth. But the bottom line is that data manipulation is required. The PTF test script is there to help. Another approach that's becoming very popular is leveraging cloud computing technology. Cloud computing technology lets you clone, maintain, bring up environments very easily. A test system can be created, loaded, refreshed, have maintenance applied, run through all the regression tests, validate, report results, and then be deleted. This can be repeated successfully on a regular schedule, even on a daily basis. Some of this technology is available from PeopleSoft now, and all of it is in the eventual roadmap. We continue to work on advancing the cloud technology and will roll out more features in future releases. Results checking with PeopleSoft Test Framework is very flexible. Anytime an error message is displayed or pops up by the system, a screenshot of the error is captured and logged automatically. That's one of the nice built-in features of PeopleSoft Test Framework. Checking the data is a bit more time-consuming. Data can be checked individually, row by row in the test case with built-in functions. Or, with a bit of programming, data can be checked in batch. One recommended approach is to query the expected results out of the database when recording the test and persisting those in a results repository. When the test executes, the last step in the test can be to query the results repository and check them against the previous run. This is a simple way to check a large volume of data very quickly and easily. PTF does not come with the tools necessary to run the compare. That's something that needs to be supplied. PeopleSoft provides a test coverage report to help you determine which tests to run. Each test in the test repository keeps a list of all the PeopleTools objects it exercises. The list includes objects like pages, records, components, and so on. When change is applied, the report looks at the objects that are part of the change and identifies which scripts should be run based upon the compare. It will also tell you what parts of the system have changed and have no regression test scripts to run. That makes it easy to identify what should be tested by hand and where you should create your new test scripts. Finally, let's look at some of the features that PeopleSoft Test Framework has that are not available in other automated testing tools. I've already talked about the test maintenance report and the test coverage report. The test maintenance report is useful to identify test cases that may have been broken as a result of maintenance being applied. The test coverage report identifies the tests that should be run as a result of applying maintenance. The test coverage report is also useful for identifying gaps in testing. There's a start login action that's useful that allows tests to be portable across PeopleSoft instances. When playback occurs, the script must apply a valid login to the system. The start login action makes the login a setting that's controlled by execution options specific to the database, as opposed to what was entered in the script at record time. That allows the script to be copied across multiple PeopleSoft databases without having to worry about a common user ID and roles and access. Page prompting is a very valuable built-in that lets test scripts open appropriate components directly without having to navigate a menu. A test script is recorded using the menu for navigation, then the script is modified by a developer to open the component directly through page prompting. Now, when played back, the menu is not used to locate the component, so when the menu changes, and it often does, the test scripts are not broken. Test scripts have access to global variables, reserved words, and understand the structure and how PeopleSoft displays its controls. There's also conditional logic that gives developers complete control of the test case. One of the more common changes is to access prompts directly by data as opposed to an index. That way, if the index or the values in the prompt change, the test won't be broken. PeopleSoft continues to improve the usability of features that are available within the PeopleSoft test framework. Now let me talk about where you can go for more information on PeopleSoft test framework. Documentation for PeopleSoft test framework is found in the PeopleTools 855 online help under the Lifecycle Management category. Remember to check the PeopleSoft information portal for updates at www.peoplesoftinfo.com. There's currently a 3-day PeopleSoft test framework course available from Oracle University. The 852 course is available now, and the 855 course is planned for late summer 2016. Automated testing is now a critical part of your lifecycle with PeopleSoft applications, and PeopleSoft Test Framework is a robust solution.